Procrastination. That's one big ugly word, isn't it? But it's appropriate because the act of procrastination could have big ugly consequences. I used to be a prolific procrastinator and I could see my dreams slipping away from me. And it made me very unhappy. It's very hard, it's frustrating and kind of painful to have ambition, but then for some reason you can't get yourself to do the work. So I did a lot of research, and my research led me mostly to the field of psychology, where indeed I discovered several potential reasons for my procrastination. And now that I think of it, that might have been an act of procrastination in itself. But I could never get to the root of the problem until I discovered a neuroscientist, Dr. Andrew Huberman's podcast, where he talks a lot about the influence of dopamine on motivation and drive. Delving more into neuroscience led me to the realization that biology trumps psychology. And in our battle against procrastination, our very first line of attack and defense is not psychology, but biology, especially neurobiology, neurochemistry, especially the chemical dopamine. We make the mistake to think that dopamine is only associated with those peaks and dips we experience when we do something that we perceive as fun. The truth, however, is that dopamine is also, perhaps even more so, about motivation and drive. As Andrew Huberman says, dopamine is the primary determinant of how motivated we are, how excited we are, how outward facing we are, and how willing we are to lean into life and pursue things. We also make the mistake to think that we are simply at the mercy of our brain chemistry, which is not true. We can control our brain chemistry to some extent. In fact, we can leverage it to our advantage. Here, it's important to be aware that we have both a phasic and a tonic release of dopamine in our brain circuits. Now, phasic release is associated with those peaks and dips we experience in dopamine. But then we also have the tonic release, which is associated with a baseline level of dopamine that is present in our brain circuits at all times. Yes, we have a baseline level of dopamine, and it's this baseline level of dopamine that is primarily responsible for how motivated we feel, how eager we are to pursue our goal. Our baseline level of dopamine is also not constant, and it's not an unlimited resource. It has to be replenished, and the time our dopamine levels are replenished is during our sleep, which makes getting good regular sleep the cornerstone of a healthy dopamine system, and one way that we can have some control over our brain chemistry. And then there are also certain activities and bad habits that are really bad for our dopamine levels. Let's call them dopamine pitfalls. Now, some of these dopamine pitfalls are very well known to us. For example, certain recreational drugs that were designed to actually flood our brains with dopamine, as well as eating sugary snacks. That's another pitfall. As well as scrolling on social media, another pitfall when it comes to optimizing our dopamine levels. So another way that we can have some control over our brain chemistry is by avoiding these pitfalls, or at least managing them better. In this video, however, I want to focus on another dopamine pitfall, something that is less talked about but is equally consequential and important for us to be aware of. And this is what's known as the extrinsic rewards trap. There was a study done by Professor Mark Lepper and some of his colleagues at Stanford University, in which they wanted to determine the influence of extrinsic rewards on a person's natural drive and desire to do something. So the researchers observed a group of children at the kindergarten during their free playtime sessions, and they identified those kids who were naturally drawn or who naturally gravitated towards drawing and other art-related activities. And they measured the amount of time these kids were spending on those activities. Then they started giving these kids some rewards for their efforts, like gold and silver stars. So every time they handed in a beautiful work of art, they'd also get the star, the gold star or the silver star, which, of course, if you know kids, you'd know that they love that. They absolutely love that. But then what the researchers did was to stop giving them the stars, stop giving them the extrinsic reward. The interesting finding was that once they stopped giving the rewards, most of these kids who were naturally drawn to these activities suddenly weren't that interested in doing them anymore. Some of them even stopped doing them altogether. Now, since that initial study, this study has been repeated with adults from different countries and different backgrounds also, with very similar results. The key takeaway from these studies is that when people engage in activities they naturally enjoy doing, and they then introduce an extrinsic reward to those activities, they tend to enjoy doing those activities a lot less and participate in them a lot less if and when that extrinsic reward is removed. This finding really fits in well with our understanding of the dopamine system, because when you introduce that extrinsic reward, that dopamine peak that we experience when we do the activity that we enjoy becomes even higher, making it even more pleasurable. However, once we remove the extrinsic reward, that peak isn't as high anymore, which means that that activity isn't as pleasurable anymore. All of this means that we should be cautious when we introduce extrinsic rewards to something that we already enjoy doing. Because in the end, if for some reason we cannot have the extrinsic reward, we may experience a reduced interest in doing that activity. For example, let's say you're someone who loves going for an early morning walk. You do it for 30 minutes every morning. But then you decide, oh, I'm going to start rewarding myself for this effort. And I'm going to go for a cup of coffee at my favorite coffee shop afterwards. Which, of course, it's going to make the whole experience even more fun. But for some reason your schedule changes and now you don't have the time to do the cup of coffee after the walk anymore. You may find that now the walk in itself without the cup of coffee doesn't feel as much fun as it used to be. Obviously, these extrinsic rewards traps it's something that we want to avoid if those activities that we naturally enjoy doing are important to us. Since I've become aware of the huge influence that dopamine has on our motivation and drive, I have started to intentionally manage my dopamine system better. I try to control the phasic release by not engaging in those pitfalls, and I try to manage my baseline level of dopamine better by, for example, trying to get good sleep every night. In the process, I was able to go from being a prolific procrastinator to now just being a sporadic procrastinator, and I don't feel that my dreams are slipping away from me anymore. Biology indeed trumps psychology. I don't want to discount the role of psychology when it comes to procrastination, because psychology is equally important. But if you are someone who has a problem with procrastination, the first thing you need to do, the first thing you need to pay attention to is your dopamine system. Optimize your dopamine system. Leverage your brain chemistry so that you can be as motivated and driven as possible. There are many things that we can and should do to optimize our dopamine system. The dopamine pitfalls and getting good sleep, those are just two aspects of it. In order to help you optimize and understand your dopamine system better, I have created a pretty comprehensive guide on this topic called Dopamine Drive. You can find this guide on my website, philipbuerta.com. There you can also sign up for my free newsletter, The Go-Getter. You will find a link to my website in the description below. Also, I'd like to hear from you. Are you guilty of participating in any of these dopamine pitfalls? And how do you manage them in your life? Maybe there is some advice that you can share with us. I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. Until next time, cheers.